Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and today I'm going to be talking about Anthony Powell's A Buyer's Market. This is the second book in his series A Dance to the Music of Time, which I'm currently hosting a year-long read-along for. There are 12 books in the series, so one book every month for the next 12 months. I will link down below the Goodreads group and also my video on A Question of Upbringing, which is the first book in the series. As I did with my video on A Question of Upbringing, I'm first going to talk about like general things I liked about this book, and then I will talk about a few particular characters and then a few particular themes. This is the second book in the series and deals with our narrator Nick in his early 20s, in the late 1920s, when he is living in London, sort of beginning life, entering society, working at a publishing house, thinking about writing fiction, and is a little bit at a loss of what's going on with his life. He's been in love with this girl, Barbara Goring, but is feeling that he probably doesn't feel the same way about her as he used to, and now he feels a little bit afloat and adrift and a little bit lonely within London society. And this book, like the first one, is quite episodical and deals with the people he meets and the things he does. It was really interesting rereading this one, actually, because this I always remembered as my favourite in the series, and I'm not sure if it is my favourite in the series, but I thought that I remembered it really well, and then I reread it and I realised I only remembered the first half, and I think most of the second half of the book I thought took place in the third book. So now I can't remember what happens in the third book, so that's beside the point. But I had in my head that this book was mostly just the first half of the book, which is that sort of great all-night two parties kind of experience, which is a really brilliant piece of writing, I think. And I thought that took up the whole book and I'd forgotten about the rest of the book, so that was a bit weird because I always had in my head that this book took place in like 24 hours and it doesn't. One thing I want to mention, partly because I forgot to talk about it in depth in my last video, is the humour of Anthony Powell's writing. I think he is an incredibly funny writer, and I think he has a kind of similar sense of humour to Charles Dickens, but I think you get a real sense of Dickensian humour both in the way that he uses language to play with kind of comic situations, and also in the use of kind of physical humour or slapstick, for want of a better word. For example, that brilliant scene where Barbara Goring pours sugar over Widmerpool and you feel sorry for him, but also it's really funny. That was the thing from this book that I remembered most, and it's been, I guess, 7 years since I read this for the first time, and one of the things from the entire series, A Dance to the Music of Time, that stands out to me most is Barbara Goring pouring sugar over Widmerpool's head. I sometimes think when you read A Dance to the Music of Time as a series, it is almost set up as this kind of, not a battle, but dichotomy between Nick and Widmerpool. This series is almost as much about Widmerpool as it is about Nick Jenkins, and that's one of the things I find so interesting. But again, I'll talk about him more in a minute. Another thing I just love about this book is the parties. Partly because I find the 1920s such an interesting period in history. The way the 1920s is presented as this period in history is really interesting, because we get this kind of sense of the roaring 20s that exists in popular culture, of all of these parties and alcohol and strange social mixes between classes that you wouldn't have expected to happen before the war. But at the same time, there are also elements of the Victorian in it. If you think about the first party that Nick goes to, it feels almost like a Victorian ball. In many ways it feels like a Victorian ball. And then he says the lyrics of the song that someone is singing, and someone's singing a song with lyrics, and suddenly it feels completely un-Victorian. And the second party he goes to feels so much more 1920s in what we envisage, but actually the 1920s is such an interesting time period, and the way in which the world sort of feels a little bit adrift also mirrors the fact that Nick feels adrift. Because the other thing I really love in this book is the background and quite subtle exploration of loneliness, and the fact that Nick doesn't really know what he's doing with his life. And that, I think, especially because he is in his early 20s, is very relatable for someone of my age, and a lot of people, I think, in their early 20s. And that, I think, is explored really interestingly and really well, especially in his relations to other characters who seem to have their life more together than him, or to older characters who have obviously lived quite a lot of their life already. I think it's also really interesting, this sort of setting of 1929, and how Nick explores how older characters deal with this world, how someone like Mr. Deacon or Uncle Giles or Sillery, who have lived a much longer time and who were sort of part of the pre-war world as well, how they exist and how they interact with this world too. Another thing I really love about the writing of this book, like the writing of the entire series, is how it balances very well kind of being in the moment and being nostalgic and sort of foreshadowing and future knowledge with not giving too much away. For example, we hear about Barnaby so much in the first half of the book before we ever meet him. We're told a lot of his phrases and his sayings and what he would think about this situation, but we haven't met him yet, and I think that's so cleverly done and so well weaved. I think it's really fantastic. It's something I really, really enjoy. And for example, there's a moment later on in the book after he's met Jean Temple again where Nick mentions a few details which give us a sense that Jean is going to be more important later on. And as I did in my video on A Question of Upbringing, I want to talk about a few of the significant characters in this book. I want to talk first about Mr. Deacon, as he is one of the first characters that appears in this book, and he plays quite an interesting role in this book because Nick starts this book with a memory of Mr. Deacon in younger days, goes through his meeting Mr. Deacon again, the sort of role that Mr. Deacon plays in his life, and then towards the end of the book Mr. Deacon dies. So most characters in the series Advance the Music of Time are recurring and crop up in many, many different books, whereas Mr. Deacon arises and is gone by the end of this book in what is, I think, quite an interesting way. But he is quite an interesting figure because Nick compares him to Uncle Giles, but also explains how different they are, and we get such different senses of Mr. Deacon and in the way that he fits into this world, his different political views, his pacifism, and also his feelings on art, and also his odd relationship with Gypsy Jones, which he says is entirely innocent and you're never quite sure whether or not it is. Mr. Deacon, I think, is created quite well in being a character that Nick Jenkins both understands and kind of likes, but also doesn't entirely approve of, and at the end of the party of Mrs. Adrianus really wants to disassociate himself with. I spoke in my video on A Question of Upbringing about how Nick is often drawn to outsiders who he both likes and kind of doesn't approve of. People like Widmerpool, people like Quiggin, and also, I would say, people like Uncle Giles and like Mr. Deacon. I want to talk briefly about Charles Stringham because he's probably my favourite character in the series. I think his role in this book is really interesting. One of the things I like about Stringham is his eccentricity, the fact that he just turns up in this coffee shop behind Nick and invites him to a party which seems to be held by his mistress, and kind of vanishes off to a nightclub. He's a strange character, and he, in many ways, is much more involved in this sort of roaring 20s culture than Nick is. He seems to live a much sort of wilder lifestyle, and at the end of the book he marries into this good family, and no one seems to quite approve of the wedding, and even the couple themselves, Nick isn't sure how on board they are with it. And Nick has this kind of great fondness for Stringham, but also a lack of knowledge about what his life is like now, and in many ways doesn't know him very well anymore. I also want to talk about Widmerpool because, as I said, he is incredibly important, and I'm sure I'll end up talking about Widmerpool in pretty much every video I do on this series because he is so interesting. And I think it's interesting as well, Nick's relationship with Widmerpool, the fact that him and Nick are kind of friends, but Nick doesn't always really like him, and that Nick finds it quite hard to view Widmerpool as a human being to begin with, because he has kind of been trained at school to view Widmerpool as something other. And so when he finds out that Widmerpool is also in love with Barbara Goring, he just can't quite credit it. And similarly, when he finds out that Widmerpool has been in some way involved with Gypsy Jones, and we are led to understand, though it's not ever explicitly said, has paid for her to have an abortion of a child that was probably not his own, Nick also is quite staggered by this, because the idea that Widmerpool would have these kind of adventures with that kind of woman seems so odd to him, because he didn't quite view Widmerpool in that light. Similarly, Nick is always confused by the fact that people of business seem to recognise something in Widmerpool, some kind of ambitious nature or some kind of talent, which Nick can never really see, and he's constantly has to adjust his opinion of Widmerpool. His interpretation of and opinion of Widmerpool is still based on Widmerpool as a schoolboy, not Widmerpool now. And this is a very important theme throughout the series, kind of Nick's misjudgment of Widmerpool as a person, and how interesting Widmerpool is. I think he's a very interesting character as well because I don't like him. He's not a likeable person. He's quite rude at times and often very dismissive of Nick's sort of career choices. Nick works in publishing and wants to be a writer. As someone who works in publishing and wants to be a writer, Widmerpool's criticism of Nick's career prospects obviously don't warm me to Widmerpool. But at the same time, there are moments where you do feel very, very sorry for Widmerpool. And I feel most sorry for him, not when he is impressing people, but when he is awkward and clumsy, and when Barbara Goring pours sugar on his head. And yeah, it is funny. It's so funny. It's so good. He's such an interesting character, I think. So thoroughly well drawn. I want to mention a few of the minor characters in the book, particularly the women. I think Gypsy Jones is a very interesting character, and very interesting in terms of where she sits in sort of 1920s class, because Mr. Deacon and Barnaby talk about her as being middle class, and she has a very different accent from all the upper class people around her and sort of presents herself as being of a lower class. When Nick first sees her, it's implied that he sort of thinks that she's a prostitute, or at least someone of kind of low moral character, I suppose. And we do get a sense that she's been breaking at least some social codes of the 1920s. But also there are moments where Nick kind of is interested in her, almost attracted to her at some points towards the end, but also not really approving or liking her. I also want to quickly talk about Barbara Goring. I think it's quite an interesting decision of Anthony Powell's to start the book when Nick is kind of falling out of love with Barbara rather than dealing with when he's falling in love with her. And it gives us quite an interesting figure of her because Nick is just sort of coming to see what might not be so likeable about her and just sort of becoming, in a way, disillusioned with her. And we get an interesting sense of her character, and I like very much how Gypsy Jones and Barbara are compared as being effectively similar personalities from different classes, and the different ways in which Nick and Widmerpool are both drawn to both Gypsy Jones and Barbara Goring are really, really interesting. I also quickly want to mention Barbara's cousin Eleanor. Not that I have very much to say about her because she isn't featured very much, but I also warm to her quite a lot, and I also quite like Nick's relationship with her because even though it's not developed properly, she's one of the few women in the book that Nick feels nothing romantic or sexual towards and just views as like a nice person who he quite gets on with. I think Barbara says something along the lines of Eleanor isn't a bad old girl once you get to know her, and Nick says that he thoroughly agrees and that's why he goes to stay with her family. I think because she is quite apart from Nick and because she is much more interested in the country and in animals than she is in dances and parties and men, Nick almost has a slightly more objective view of her than the other people and is much more aware of her own interests and life, whereas for many of the other female characters in this book, Nick's much more aware of them in relation to himself. Which leads me quickly on to talking about Jean Temple. I don't have too much to say about her here, but I think it's interesting to see how she has changed from her brief mentions in the first book, where she was very cold and very quiet, and here she's very different, and that's partly because she's grown up, and it's partly because Nick is seeing her in new surroundings and seeing her now married and associated with a different world. And because he is so startled to see her, and yet he is also very drawn to her. And yet he can't quite work out in the sort of afternoon he spends with Jean whether or not he likes her. And this is quite interesting, I think, because he's definitely drawn to her, but he also at times thinks he doesn't like her, and it's partly to do with jealousy and confusion at the life that she leads and not really understanding what she thinks about him. But it's also quite interesting that she is presented so much as an enigma to Nick. And I think that's all the characters I wanted to talk a bit more about in the buyer's market, but I do want to touch on a few themes before I go. I already spoke a little bit about the theme of kind of loneliness and being slightly adrift in your early 20s, which I think is very interesting, especially as Nick compares himself to the people around him who are married, like Stringham or Jean Temple, or the people who seem to be progressing in their career in a different way, like Widmerpool. Even the way he compares his literary life with that of Mark Members and Quiggin when he meets them at Mr. Deacon's birthday, these people who seem to be able to write novels really easily, and Nick feels a bit like he has not achieved as much as the other people his age. Which leads me, I suppose, onto talking about the theme of kind of creativity and artistry, which I think is quite important throughout the series. Music plays an important role, as does painting. There are so many paintings mentioned in this book, and obviously Mr. Deacon and Barnaby as artists play an important role, and the way that they discuss other art around them and sort of modern art versus traditional art is really, really interesting. One of the people on the Goodreads group posted a link to where you can find pictures of and sort of writing about all of the paintings mentioned in the entire series, Dance the Music of Time. I will link that down in the description below. And I also think the way that sort of writing is explored in this book is really interesting. Nick sort of contemplates on the way home from the party, writing something interesting and philosophical, and then decides that perhaps he'd rather sleep. He's thinking about writing a novel, but he finds it quite hard to begin, and people around him seem to know what to do more, and this kind of wishing to do something creative and not knowing quite how to go about it is, I think, really, really interesting. Which leads me on, I suppose, to talking about sort of work and ambition. Nick, on the one hand, feels that he has slightly fallen behind some of his contemporaries, but at the same time he doesn't seem as ambitious as someone like Widmerpool is. We have these figures like Bill Truscott, who sort of considered destined to do great things at university, and yet in a way seem to have kind of stagnated and to be in the same position that they've been in for a long time. Charles Stringham similarly, these people aren't sort of moving around in their career, yet Widmerpool seems to be moving very, very fast, he's very, very ambitious, and in comparison to Nick, who's kind of just going along with his life, many people feel to him to be a little bit ahead. And this theme of kind of work and ambition and the differences between sort of creative ambitions and sort of political or economic ambitions are really quite interestingly dealt with here. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about sort of class and social position, because I think it's quite interestingly dealt with in this book. I spoke already about the fact that this book is very interestingly set in 1929, and in a way this series, spanning from the 1920s to the 1970s, sort of follows the collapse of a very rigid class structure and the collapse of the upper classes. Nick is part of upper class society, but in a way he's much more upper middle class, and he also associates with someone like Mr. Deacon and Barnaby, who don't seem to be of quite the same class. Similarly, those two first first parties we get. We get first a very sort of traditional upper class party, which feels almost, as I said earlier, like a Victorian ball. And then we get this second party, which Charles Stringham describes as being a low party, which also consists of many people who are upper class. But at the same time, it's a slightly less rigid place where there are people of different classes. There are even people who aren't white there. It's a party that's much looser in its social structure than the first. And in a way, I think the book kind of explores the sort of breakdown of particular class boundaries and the way that class sort of changes over the time period. And I think the way that these two parties sort of demonstrate that, the first being sort of much more rigid and the second a little bit different, is really, really interesting. I think that's all I wanted to say about A Buyer's Market. Please let me know down in the comments if you're taking part in the read-along and how you enjoyed this book, what your thoughts on it were, and if you have anything else to add that I haven't talked about in this video. I'm really looking forward to reading the third book in the series, An Acceptance World, in the month of May. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.